The church bell was still ringing when I realized she wasn't coming. The flowers wilted on the altar. The guests looked at each other, and my son, the happiest man in the world that morning, knelt before an emptiness. "She'll come back, Mom, she'll come back, right?" he said, his eyes welling up. But I already knew. I knew since the day before, since her silence at dinner, since the strange perfume on her handkerchief, and yet I remained silent. That moment, I understood that love can be the cruelest of gods. It makes us believe until the last second. The dress was left hanging on the chair, the bouquet was never thrown, and the altar became the tomb of a dream. My son was never the same again. And I lived to watch the slow death of a living man. All started that day, the day the bride ran away with the gardener. I remember the first day I noticed my son was different, like someone finding a sliver of light through the old kitchen curtain. He arrived early, whistled off-key, and played with his hair like he did when he was a boy. The laughter came easily from the corner of his mouth, and I pretended not to notice, so he could tell me without rushing. The coffee tasted different, sweeter, as if the sugar had learned to listen. "Mom, I can't explain," he'd say, and I'd just shake my head, giving space to the miracle. Who am I to rush a heart? There was a new lightness in his step, but also a care, a zeal that only those in love understand. He opened a window before the sun and let the wind in, as if the house needed to breathe with it. I watched him straighten his shirt, check his watch, check his phone like someone keeping a precious secret. And that sparkle in his eyes, that sparkle I've known since his first cry. "Is it someone?" I ventured, like someone playing an old violin. He smiled with his lips and responded with silence. Back then, the house seemed bigger, perhaps because hope expands walls. The pots sang, the flower-filled cottage took on meaning, the living room clock ticked the hours without disturbing. I took care of the silly details, the neat dishcloth, the lint-free tablecloth, the vase with basil sprigs. It's silly, I know, but a mother tries to prepare the world for when love decides to walk through the door. "Don't make a fuss, Mom," he'd joke, and I'd feign normalcy. Inside, a party of bells. The days began to have their own names, as if each one were stamped by her. Monday smelled of new soap. Tuesday of warm bread. Wednesday brought a light breeze, the kind that fixes your hair without asking permission. By Thursday, even the old radio was less out of tune. And when Friday came, I'd put on a better dress for no reason, just to live up to what was emerging. Ridiculous? Maybe. Real? Too real. I was making lunch, and he was chopping onions without shedding a tear. Just imagine the absurdity. He told me he'd bumped into her on his way out of the bookstore, a stumble, an apology, a smile that stretched across the hallway. "It seems like time has stopped," he said, and I bit back the urge to say that time only respects those who love. I pretended to continue the recipe, stirring the sauce slowly. Inside, I was already embroidering the future on the back of my apron. I spent nights rehearsing questions, as if love were a play and I were the costume designer. Who is it? What do you like? Have you suffered? What are you afraid of? None of them dared to leave intact. Because there are things we must let fate tell us, at its own pace. I simply prayed to God that if it was going to hurt, it would hurt only a little. And if it was going to stay, that it would find a place at our table. My faith had the hands of a mother. He, who had always been reserved, began to talk about music, poems, and small cafes on street corners without rushing. Someone who looked at him without rushing, who laughed at the same silly things, who listened to the pauses. "Mom, when she talks, everything settles," he murmured, and the phrase echoed in the china cabinet. I arranged the glasses, like someone arranging stars. I didn't want to ask further. Some things go sour when we open the lid too soon. One afternoon of gentle rain, he appeared with a crooked umbrella and a smile that didn't quite fit on his face or in his hands. "I think I found it," he said, and the wind blew through the door as if it had heard. I gripped the edge of the table to keep from embracing the world. Then take care of it, I replied, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. He understood the message. Love, my son, is a garden. It bears flowers, it bears thorns, it requires work. I began to notice he was spending more time in front of the mirror, but not out of vanity. It was politeness. A man who wants to be worthy of the shine he's received. The scent of the new perfume lingered in the house, mingling with coffee and clean clothes. I walked through the rooms as if reviewing a prayer. Every corner needed to be at peace. If she were to enter, may she find rest. And if she didn't, may she at least know she was expected. In this mix of hope and fear, I became a girl again for a few moments. I remembered my own beginnings, the navy blue dress, the worn shoes, the courage of someone who had nothing but a future in her pocket. The past whispered to me, "Be gentle." The present replied, "Be firm." And I stood there, between one thing and another, warming the soup and my heart. Because every beautiful story scares a little, doesn't it? At the end of that month, he arrived with a look that asked for a blessing, without saying a word. I kissed his forehead and felt a sweet weight, the kind life gives you when you're about to turn. "Mom, I think it's serious now," he said, and I could only take a deep breath. I felt the ground align, like someone finding the right beat in an old song. But the music of destiny, oh, it has beats we don't master. And that's exactly when everything began to move, to where I didn't yet know. She first appeared on a Saturday afternoon, as the sun streamed lazily through the balcony windows. I was tending the plants when I heard her voice, sweet, firm, with a musicality that seemed rehearsed. "Good afternoon, ma'am," she said, holding a cake wrapped in a flowery cloth. Her politeness disarmed me instantly. She entered smiling, and for a moment, time seemed to tip its hat. My son looked at her as if he had just found his way. Emily was beautiful, but not in an obvious way. She had a quiet beauty, the kind that doesn't ask for permission. Her hair fell like silk, her perfume was light, and her gestures were calculated with a studied kindness. As she spoke, she lightly touched his arm, and he laughed, a laugh I hadn't heard in years. I watched silently, trying to decipher if it was charm or a trap. Mothers learn early to read the silences that love disguises. Over coffee, she praised everything: the smell of the house, the taste of the food, even the faded curtains. "Everything here has a soul," he said, and I felt a strange knot in my chest. It was beautiful to hear, but it sounded rehearsed, like a melody played 1,000 times. Still, I wanted to believe, because believing is what a mother does best. And in that moment, my son seemed so happy that any shadow of it felt like ingratitude. In the following days, she began to visit the house naturally. She brought flowers, helped in the kitchen, and told childhood stories that seemed straight out of a book. Sometimes I found myself liking her. Too much. She knew how to listen, asked questions, looked into my eyes. But there was something in her gaze that escaped, like someone carrying a secret in their dress pocket. A quick flash, but enough to keep me awake at night. My poor son was already living in another world. He spent hours on the phone, writing notes and exchanging messages as if breathing. "Mom, she's different," he'd say. And I watched him lose himself a little more each day. He'd say Emily made him want to be better, that she inspired him, that she understood him without words. I'd just smile and reply, "Be careful with loves that seem perfect, my son. Perfection sometimes masks emptiness." One afternoon, while washing the dishes, I noticed them in the garden. He was talking animatedly, gesturing, and she was just smiling. But that smile, there was something about it that didn't match his gaze. As if his lips were saying yes, but his heart was elsewhere. It stuck in my head for days. And the more I tried to forget, the more the scene came back, insistent, like a song that refused to stop. Little by little, she began to occupy spaces, not only in his heart, but in the house. A forgotten book on the sofa, a scarf draped over the chair, a new scent in the air. Small invasions that transformed the home into shared territory. And I, silently, observed it all, unsure whether to rejoice or protect myself. Because there are presences that warm, and others that, however beautiful, change the mood without asking permission. One night, as I was closing the windows, I heard them talking on the balcony. She talked about travel, about Europe, about freedom. My son said he'd never needed anything but her. "Promise you'll never leave me?" he asked. And the silence that followed was so long that the wind seemed to stop. She replied after a few seconds, "I promise." But her voice trembled, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. In the days that followed, she began to avoid certain topics. When we talked about the future, she deflected. When the topic turned to marriage, she smiled and changed the subject. I noticed her discomfort, but my son, blinded by love, saw only enchantment. I tried to gently warn him, but he said, "Mom, don't complicate what is simple." Oh, if only he knew how much abyss can hide in simplicity. Still, something inside me wanted to believe, because his love was too beautiful to end in distrust. So I kept quiet. I accepted the visits, the dinners, the laughter. And every time she said goodbye with a kiss on my cheek, I felt her scent linger in the air, light but cold. Cold as someone who's already leaving, even before saying goodbye. The months leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of fabrics, flowers, and expectations. The house seemed to exude a festive atmosphere, lace draped over the table, home decor magazines scattered across the sofa, and a constant coming and going of phone calls and endless lists. My son's heart was in the clouds, and I tried to keep his feet on the ground. "Marriage is more than just a beautiful day, my son," I'd say, and he'd just laugh. "Mom, it's the beginning of forever." Oh, if only forever were as big as the love he felt. Emily had an impressive talent for planning. She chose the dress with almost mathematical precision, every detail rehearsed as if it were a scene from a movie. She talked about the flowers, the lights, the colors, and I watched her enthusiasm with a certain admiration, mixed with a quiet unease. There was something theatrical about it all, a gleam in her eyes that seemed more fascinated by the occasion than by the man waiting for her at the altar. Still, I restrained myself. A mother's heart sometimes confuses zeal with fear. Family gatherings were a spectacle in themselves. Emily charmed everyone with her smile and her stories of travels, expensive restaurants, and influential friends. My son, beside her, looked like a boy before a lighthouse. "She's everything I've ever wanted," he'd say, and I'd just respond with a tired smile. Because deep down, something told me he didn't see who she was, but who he wanted her to be. And that difference, my God, is the abyss where so many loves are lost. Meanwhile, I occupied myself with the practical details, the cake, the bouquet, the favors. These little things kept me sane, as if tending to the preparations was my way of protecting what could still be saved. At night, alone in the kitchen, I folded napkins and spoke to God, praying only that their love would be true. Because if it weren't, the fall would be too great for my boy's heart. One day, during a dress fitting, I noticed Emily distracted, staring at her reflection in the mirror with a distant look. "Is everything okay, dear?" I asked. She smiled, but her gaze didn't follow. "Just nervous, Mrs. Helena," she replied, touching the necklace around her neck. That gesture chilled me. It was the kind of touch we give when we're trying to hide something, not when we're just anxious. But once again, I remained silent. Sometimes, silence is the only form of love left. At church rehearsals, my son was radiant. In his suit, he looked like a complete man. With every step he took, pride washed over me like a warm current. I remembered the boy who held my finger to cross the street and thought, he's grown up. The priest spoke of unity, patience, and fidelity, and I watched Emily beside him, motionless, her eyes fixed on the stained glass window. It was as if she were in another place, far from everyone, even himself. Last week, he asked me for help writing his vows. We spent the evening together, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and an open notebook. "I want her to feel how much I love her, Mom." The words came out with purity, a sincerity that cut through the air. I helped him revise, suppressing the tears that insisted on coming. He put the paper in his pocket and said, "Tomorrow I give my heart." And inside, a part of me feared he wouldn't get it back. The day before, the house was an organized chaos. Boxes, ribbons, arrangements. Emily entered wearing a simple dress and a thoughtful look. "Everything will be fine," she said, but her voice sounded more like an attempt at persuasion than a certainty. My son hugged her, and she responded with the delicacy of someone fulfilling an expected gesture. It was there, in that moment, that something inside me broke, a dry premonition, without warning, without sound, as if fate had whispered something I couldn't yet understand. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood on the porch watching the city lights. The wind was warm, and the flowers in the garden swayed gently. I thought about all the promises I'd heard in my life, those that came to fruition and those that time had swallowed. Promises are fragile bridges, built with words. Some hold, others crumble in the first storm. And I knew, somehow, that a storm was brewing. The next morning, the sun rose more beautiful than ever, as if the heavens themselves wanted to bless this love. But as the coffee brewed and the bells rang, I felt a strange chill in my chest. I looked out the window and saw my son adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. He smiled confidently, ready for happily ever after. And I, with trembling hands, simply whispered, "May God protect you, my son, because there are promises love cannot keep." He arrived on a rainy late afternoon when the sky seemed washed clean and the earth exuded that damp scent of new beginnings. His name was Victor, a soft-spoken boy with a light accent and a gaze that avoided confrontation. Emily introduced him as a recommendation from a friend. "He's great with flowers. He'll make the garden look lovely." I, who had always tended my own plants, felt a strange tightness in my chest. But I agreed, out of respect for her enthusiasm. He was just a gardener, or so we all thought. The first day, he worked in silence. He arranged the rose bushes with precision, cut away the dead branches, and swept the ground as if praying. There was something almost poetic in the way he touched the plants, a calmness that contrasted with the bustling energy of the house. Emily appeared on the porch with a glass of lemonade and watched quietly. I saw her gaze, long, curious, enveloped in something I couldn't name. And it was then that I felt the first chill of foreboding. As the days passed, they began to talk more. First about flowers, then about travel, and soon about life. He spoke of European cities, ancient gardens, freedom. And she listened to him as if she were looking into a mirror. I, from the kitchen window, feigned distraction while washing the dishes, but every word seemed to pass through the glass. The tone of their voices changed. It was no longer work talk. It was the beginning of a dangerous connection. One afternoon, I called my son over to talk. "Don't you think Emily spends too much time with the gardener?" I asked, choosing my words carefully. He laughed, amused. "Oh, Mom, she only likes flowers. You're seeing things where there aren't any." I wanted to believe it, I swear I did. But mothers don't see with their eyes. They see with their souls. And my soul had already sounded the alarm. Victor began to stay longer than necessary. He'd finish his work but remain in the garden, sitting on the bench, watching the sunset. Emily would sometimes bring him coffee, other times just sit beside him. Subtle, almost innocent scenes, but they scream when the heart is attentive. Love, when it betrays, always begins slowly, first with gentle words, then with complicit silences. One morning, I came down early and found them talking in the greenhouse. She was holding a flower, and he was lightly touching her hand to show her the stem. The gesture lasted seconds, but it was enough to chill me to the bone. Emily quickly pulled away when she saw me, forcing a smile. "Good morning, Donna Helena," she said, as if nothing had happened. I replied, but inside, my heart was already heavy as stone. The garden, once sacred, was now the scene of a secret. In the days that followed, I noticed Emily seemed lighter, more alive, but not because of my son. It was a different kind of glow, one that couldn't be faked. My poor son thought she was just excited about the wedding. "She's radiant, Mom," he'd say, and I'd respond with a wry smile, trying to hide my fear. Her joy felt like that of someone who discovered a forbidden freedom, and I knew that happiness like that comes at a high price. I began to notice details. Her perfume had changed, her way of grooming herself. She spent more time in the garden than in the living room, and sometimes she came back with dirt on her hands, something unthinkable just weeks before. One night, I noticed dirt on the hallway floor and boot tracks leading to the back door. I went to check, but everything was locked, or so it seemed. Doubt began to plague my nights. One afternoon, the sky darkened and the wind brought the scent of a storm. From my room, I saw them both running for shelter on the porch. She laughed loudly, and he, dripping wet, looked at her in a way I'd never seen my son look. That moment was trapped in time, two strangers united by the rain, while the man who truly loved her prepared for the wedding. I closed the curtain and collapsed onto the bed, praying to God my eyes had betrayed me. But the heart is never wrong. And that night, hearing the raindrops hitting the roof, I understood that something had changed forever. The gardener wasn't just the man who tended the flowers. He was the man who, unintentionally or without guilt, was beginning to pull out, one by one, the roots of my son's life. At first, I tried to deny what I saw. I convinced myself it was just an illusion, a figment of my tired mind. But a mother's heart, when it's suspicious, never goes back to sleep peacefully. I began to notice subtle gestures, looks that lingered a second too long, suppressed laughter, uncomfortable silences when I entered the room. Victor's presence became constant, as if the garden had no end. And Emily, once reserved, had now become a restless bird, always looking for a corner to perch and another to flee. One morning, while pouring coffee, I noticed his perfume on the handkerchief she'd left on the table. It was a woody, distinctive scent, impossible to mistake. "Did you change your perfume?" I asked, trying to hide it. She glanced at me too quickly, nervously, and replied, "Oh, yes, it's a new one I got." I smiled, but inside my stomach churned. Get it from whom? These questions the mouth dares not say aloud, the heart answers with silence. My son, blinded by love, noticed nothing. He worked late, preparing the final details of the wedding. "Emily is the best thing that ever happened to me," he would say, and I would pretend to agree. His every word was a stab wound coated in sweetness. At night, I would hear him humming in his room, while she stood on the porch, looking out at the garden. The same garden, the same man, the same flowers that now hid secrets. One day, while collecting the cloves from the line, I found a note in the pocket of her dress. Small, folded in four, stained with dirt. "Tomorrow, same place." I stood still, my heart pounding in my throat. I considered showing it to my son, but hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if it was just paranoia? But my intuition whispered, it wasn't. I kept the note with me, not out of revenge, but out of fear of what the truth might cause. That night, I decided to observe unseen. The house was asleep. The wind was gentle. Around 10 o'clock, I heard discreet footsteps in the hallway. I looked out the window and saw Emily crossing the yard, barefoot, heading toward the greenhouse. My palms were sweating. I ran to the porch, and from there I saw them. She and Victor, together, talking in whispers. There were no kisses, but the body speaks and they're screamed. I stood there, mute, watching my son's love unravel before my eyes. In the following days, Emily feigned normalcy. She smiled, talked about flowers and dresses, but there was a hidden nervousness in her eyes. She began avoiding his touch, making excuses to go out alone. "I have to take care of wedding things," she'd say. My son believed everything, and I, to spare him, kept quieter and quieter. Silence became both my refuge and my prison. One day, Victor brought a bouquet of white lilies. "They're your favorites," he said, handing them to her in front of everyone. Emily blushed, my son smiled, and I felt the ground give way beneath my feet. The audacity of it shocked me. How could betrayal be so delicate, so beautifully packaged in the appearance of kindness? I went to my room, closed the door, and cried, not just for him, but for myself, who could do nothing. Time, cruel, was no relief. Each day brought a new sign, a new certainty. Averted glances, deleted messages, ready-made excuses. And the more she lied, the sweeter she became with my son, as if trying to make up for it. He happily said, "I don't think I've ever loved like this." And I thought, you've never been so deceived either. But swallowing the truth is the price of protecting what you love. One afternoon, she appeared with a different, lost look. I watched her as she arranged the bouquet of flowers in the living room. "Is everything okay, Emily?" I asked. She hesitated, took a deep breath, and replied, "Just tired." But her tiredness had a name, and I knew it. In that moment, I realized she was no longer here. Her body remained, but her heart had already departed. And that was when I began counting the days. I didn't know why, but I felt something approaching, something big, irreversible. The wedding was just around the corner. His love was blooming blindly, and hers was silently withering. I could see the petals falling one by one, and no word I could say would change the outcome. Because when love decides to run away, not even God can lock it at home. The eve of the wedding arrived shrouded in a strange silence, the kind that doesn't belong to joy or sadness. It just hangs heavy in the air. The house was filled with flowers, and yet their scent seemed suffocating. Emily spent the day restless, moving from room to room, pretending to take care of pending matters. My son, radiant, smiled at everyone and everything, unaware that the bride seemed absent. "She's nervous, Mom. It's normal," he said. But it wasn't nervousness, it was dismissal. I felt it. That morning, she avoided coffee. She said she wasn't hungry, but her hand trembled as she held the cup. "Is everything okay, Emily?" I asked gently. She nodded, forcing a smile. Her look, however, said something else. It was the look of someone carrying a weight they can no longer hide. My son arrived soon after, kissed her forehead, and said, "Tomorrow our life begins." She responded with only a barely audible yes. That gave me goosebumps. The day dragged on, as if time refused to pass. The bridesmaids came to adjust details, the groomsmen confirmed schedules, and the church was ready, waiting only for tomorrow. But inside the house, something was silently crumbling. Emily locked herself in her room for hours, and when she emerged, her eyes were red. "It was the dress that moved me," she explained. A blatant lie. And I, cowardly, accepted the lie, because sometimes the truth is crueler than deception. Late in the afternoon, the gardener showed up. He said he'd just come to finish some unfinished work. I saw him talking to Emily at the gate from afar. Their words were lost in the wind, but the gestures of their hands betrayed everything. When he left, she stood there, watching the car disappear down the road. I watched her through the window and saw something fade inside her. It wasn't indecision. It was the certainty of someone who had already made an irreversible decision. That night, dinner was a farce. My son chattered excitedly, making honeymoon plans, and Emily just nodded, smiling blankly. The lit candles flickered, as if they, too, sensed the tension in the air. When he left the table, she got up and went to the window. She stood there, motionless, staring into the darkness. "Is everything ready?" I asked. She replied, "Yes, everything ready." But her voice sounded like she was saying, "It's late." Later, while everyone was asleep, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I opened the door and saw Emily coming down the stairs with a small suitcase. "Where are you going, girl?" I asked, my heart pounding. She stopped, surprised, and murmured, "I'm just going for a walk. I can't sleep." I smiled, pretending to believe her. She left. I waited, checking my watch. Half an hour. 1 hour. 2. The sound of the gate opening never came. Only the wind. In the early hours of the morning, the phone rang. It was the driver hired to take her to the church. "Mrs. Helena, the bride isn't answering her phone. The car is waiting." My legs felt weak. I ran upstairs to her room. Empty. The dress hung, the veil folded, the bouquet untouched. On the dressing table, a short note. "Sorry. Nothing more." Just a word that carried the weight of tragedy. I woke my son, trying to hide my panic. "She must have had to take care of something last minute," I lied. He, confident, believed me. He put on his suit, straightened his tie, and smiled in the mirror. "She's going to be the most beautiful woman in the world." I hugged him tightly, as if to protect him from the pain that was already on its way. He didn't understand, but he hugged me back. "Mom, don't cry. It's the happiest day of my life." And I cried. I cried because I knew it was my last. In that moment, I understood that true love doesn't blind. It's hope that does. It blinded him, and I, out of love, closed my eyes with it. The night passed slowly, suffocatingly, and when the sun rose, the house was silent. The dress still hanging, the note on the table, and the silence, the same silence that precedes a tragedy. The sun rose, gilding the mountains, as if the sky, oblivious to fate, still believed it would be a happy day. The flowers arrived early, the choir was preparing, and the church exuded a scent of hope mixed with incense. My son wore the suit he had chosen, eager, with that sparkle in his eyes only those who truly love know. "She's going to walk in, and the world will stop," he told me, laughing. I smiled back, but my soul wept inside, because I already knew his world was about to fall apart. In the church, everyone waited. The guests whispered, the musicians tuned their instruments, and the priest checked his watch for the 3rd time. The bride's car should have arrived half an hour ago. I tried to hide my anxiety, telling everyone it was just a common delay. "Traffic, maybe," I repeated, trying to believe my own words. But every minute that passed was a stab in the back. Time, cruel as it was, seemed to mock us. My son paced back and forth, adjusting his jacket, glancing at the gate with every engine sound that appeared in the distance. "She's coming, Mom. She's coming, right?" All I could do was hold his hand and say, "It'll be okay." But the cold sweat on my forehead betrayed otherwise. The clock struck 11 when the priest approached, embarrassed. "Maybe we should wait a little longer." And that's when I realized my hope was beginning to fade. The choir, tired, practiced low notes to disguise their embarrassment. Some bridesmaids looked at each other uneasily. One, trying to soothe the mood, said, "These brides really take their time. It's tradition." But I could see the growing doubt in everyone's eyes. And, amidst whispers, the question spread, "Where's the bride?" My son tried to smile, but his voice was already shaking. "She must be almost here." And each time he said it, it sounded hollower. His cell phone rang. He answered quickly, his heart racing. It was the driver, his voice trembling on the other end. "Sir, I was at the address, but you didn't show up." My son's face paled. "What do you mean you didn't show up?" he shouted in disbelief. The entire church fell silent. The priest lowered his head. And in that instant, even without understanding everything, everyone knew Something terrible had happened. He ran to me, desperate. Mom, she must be home. Something's happened. I wanted to lie, wanted to say yes, that it was just a misunderstanding. But the note was still in my pocket, and the weight of that small piece of paper felt like it was burning my skin. Let's go look for her, my son, I said, trying to restrain him. But hope, when panicked, doesn't listen to reason. As he hurried out, stumbling down the church steps, one of the bridesmaids received a message. Her phone vibrated loudly, and everyone turned. She read it softly, pale, and looked at me with teary eyes. Dona Helena, it's from Emily. Time stood still.
Sorry.
I can't. That was it. 2 sentences that sealed a fate. My son fell to his knees, as if the ground had disappeared beneath him. The choir fell silent. The guests began to leave in confused murmurs. The priest, speechless, put away the book and blew out the candles. I ran to my son and hugged him, but he didn't react. He stared blankly at the altar, his eyes empty, as if his soul had left his body. Why? He repeated. Why? I couldn't answer. No mother can explain the inexplicable. Minutes turned into hours. The church emptied, the flowers wilted, and the sun began to set, taking with it what little color remained of the day. The wedding didn't happen, but the funeral of innocence did, silent, cruel, inevitable. When I finally managed to get him out of there, he walked like a man lost in direction, repeating her name like a broken mantra. And that's how the big day ended. No bride, no party, no music. Just the muffled footsteps of a devastated man and the suppressed tears of a mother who, once again, couldn't prevent the tragedy already written. The day that promised to be the beginning of a new life became the mark of the end of all certainties.
Time stood still inside that church.
The flowers began to lose their brightness. The perfume mingled with the scent of an extinguished candle, and the silence weighed more heavily than any words. My son remained kneeling before the altar, his eyes fixed on nothing, as if still waiting for the door to open and her to enter. She'll come back. Mom, she'll come back, he repeated, without looking at me. I knelt beside him and simply held his hand. How can you say that some loves don't return, even when the heart begs? The bridesmaids fought back tears, the groomsmen whispered among themselves, and the priest, embarrassed, murmured prayers under his breath. Every footstep in the aisle made everyone turn, but no one came. Outside, the sun burned mercilessly, melting the bouquet that would never be thrown. The driver, pale, still waited in the car, unsure whether to go or stay. And inside me, the premonition that had been growing for days was now confirmed. She wouldn't come. Never again. Minutes turned into hours. The clock read almost 2 in the afternoon when the choir dispersed. Some guests left discreetly, avoiding my son's eyes. Others tried to console me, saying empty words. She must have been unwell. Something unexpected happened. But I saw in their faces what no one said out loud. Everyone knew she had run away. All that was missing was the proof, and her silence was the cruelest proof. I returned home before him. I needed a breath to face what was to come. The room was as we'd left it, the dress hanging, the veil draped over the chair, and the note, that damned note. I took it with trembling hands. I'm sorry, that was all. So short, so cowardly, so devastating. I felt a cold rage rise in my throat, not for myself, for him, for seeing my son, a pure man, torn apart by the cowardice of a false love. When he arrived, his gaze was that of someone who had died inside. He entered silently, went upstairs, and locked the door. I tried to call out to him, but my voice failed. In the room, I heard the sound of muffled crying, the kind that tears at the soul. I sat on the stairs and cried with him, silently, because sometimes a mother's pain is just the echo of her child's. And in that moment, the whole house seemed to cry with us. Late in the afternoon, the phone rang. It was the police. At first, I didn't understand what they wanted, until they heard her name. Miss Emily boarded an international flight early this morning, accompanied by a foreign man. They left before the wedding. My breath caught. I felt the ground disappear. A gardener, perhaps? I asked, almost without meaning to. On the other end, silence. Then, a dry confirmation.
Yes.
It was him. I ran to my son's room, desperate. My son, we need to talk. He was sitting on the bed, his face drained of color, his gaze lost. She left, didn't she? He asked before I could even say anything. I just nodded. He took a deep breath, as if trying to accept the impossible, and murmured, "With him?" My silence was the answer, and that silence weighed more than 1,000 words. He stood and walked to the window. He stood there, motionless, staring at the horizon. For a moment, I thought he was going to scream, break something, blame the world, but no. He just sighed, with a serenity that broke my heart. I just wish she had told the truth, Mom. I would have forgiven her.
Those were his last words that day.
After that, silence became his language. That night, when everyone was asleep, I entered the room and found him sitting, staring at the wedding dress hanging on the chair. The lamplight illuminated him like a scene frozen in time. "Why did she do that, Mom?" he asked softly, never taking his eyes off the fabric. "Because there are people who don't know how to love, my son," I replied. He didn't react. He just continued staring, as if waiting for the dress to answer for her. And that's how the day ended. No wedding, no party, no return. Just a white dress that was never worn, a bouquet that wilted without being thrown, and a heart that learned, the hard way, that love, when it's a lie, can destroy even the most alive thing inside us. The night seemed endless. The house was plunged into a dense silence, broken only by the sound of the wind hitting the windows. I tried to fall asleep, but the thought of him upstairs, alone, kept me from closing my eyes. Around 2 in the morning, I heard slow footsteps in the hallway. I got up and found my son sitting on the stairs, his phone in his hands. His face pale, his gaze fixed on the screen. "Mom, she texted," he whispered. And in that moment, my heart nearly stopped in my chest. I sat beside him, dreading what was to come. He turned his phone slowly, as if the gesture weighed a ton. The message was short, cruel, and cold. "I'm sorry. I can't." No question mark, no explanation, no trace of regret. Just that empty, soulless sentence. He read and reread it, as if the words could change meaning if looked at with more faith. "I can't what, Mom? Love me? Keep the promise? Live." I wanted to answer, but nothing came out. Because sometimes pain doesn't need answers, just the courage to endure. Minutes later, another message arrived. "I'm leaving. Take care." It was like a blade slicing through the air. He clutched the phone so tightly I thought it would break. "She didn't love me, Mom. I was just a temporary shelter." I tried to comfort him, but every word seemed futile. "Son, there are people who come into our lives just to teach us to be strong." He looked at me, his eyes welling up, and said, "So, she taught me to die inside." I spent the night beside him, watching the emptiness take shape. Sometimes he'd type a reply but delete it before sending it. Other times, he'd just stare at the phone, as if hoping for a miracle. At 4 in the morning, he finally said, "If she ever wants to come back, I'll be here." And I, with my heart in pieces, knew that this being here wasn't a promise, it was a condemnation. Because waiting for someone who doesn't return is the punishment of those who love too much. At dawn, he handed me his phone and said, "Delete it, Mom. I never want to see this again." But I couldn't. I didn't have the courage. I held on to those messages like someone who holds onto a ghost. I knew he would need to say goodbye to the pain one day, and when that day came, perhaps her words would serve as proof, or as healing. Throughout the morning, we tried to feign normalcy. I made coffee, prepared bread, and placed the remaining bouquet in the center of the table. But everything seemed like a scene of undeclared mourning. The phone rang, friends asked questions, the local press even reported the last-minute wedding cancellation. I would turn off the radio and hug him. "Forget it, my son. She chose another path." And he would whisper, "I just want to understand why." Days later, the messages haunted me again. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and reread them. It was as if each word echoed a piece of what was left. "I'm sorry. I can't." That phrase haunted me. Can I love?
Stay? Pretend?
Live? No mother can bear to see her child destroyed, not knowing what to fight against. And I had no visible enemy, only memories. One night, I heard noise in his room. I crept in and saw him writing something in a notebook. "Letters, Mom," he said without looking up. "Maybe she'll read them someday." The words he'd never been able to send began to pile up there, pages and pages of pent-up pain, of unrequited love. I wanted to stop him, but I couldn't, because sometimes writing is the only way the heart finds to keep beating. The days blended together, and her message became a legend within the house, a symbol of everything that could have been and wasn't. And while he tried to erase the past, I silently harbored the same fear, that a heart so broken would forget to beat again. That's when I realized her message wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the fall. From that moment on, my son stopped being who he was, and the love that once made him smile began to destroy him from within. 2 days had passed since the wedding that never happened. The house felt like a tomb. The flowers had wilted, the dress hung on the chair, and the silence was so heavy that even the ticking of the clock sounded like a scream. My son barely ate, barely spoke, just wandered the rooms like a shadow. I tried to maintain my routine, but even the smell of coffee seemed sad. Then the phone rang, and the voice on the other end changed everything forever. "Miss Helena?" asked a man with a foreign accent. "This is the airport. We need to confirm some information." My heart raced. He mentioned Emily's name and said she had boarded an international flight that morning. "Can you confirm she traveled with Victor, the gardener?" I was speechless. The ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. The confirmation I'd feared, delivered just like that, cold, technical, and emotionless. I ran to my son's room with trembling hands. He lay motionless, staring at the ceiling. "Son, we need to talk." He sat up slowly, exhausted. "Is it about her?" he asked. I nodded. I handed him the paper where I'd written the name of the flight. He read it silently, and a tear fell unnoticed. "So it's true," he murmured. "She ran away with him." His voice sounded broken like glass, and I, helpless, just hugged him. Later, confirmation came on television. A small news item, hidden among others. Businesswoman's wedding cancelled. Bride flies to Europe with family employee. My son watched without blinking. The news report showed images from the airport, and there they were side by side, smiling. He let out a sound I'll never forget, a laugh mixed with despair. "Look, Mom, she's happy." I tried to wrest control from him, but he wouldn't let me. He kept saying, "She's happy, Mom. Look how happy she is." And the more he said it, the more I felt the pain growing. My God, what did she do to him? I thought. It wasn't just betrayal. It was destruction. The woman he loved had left him for a stranger, and she did it on the day she was supposed to promise eternal love. For the next few days, he locked himself in his room. He refused visitors, food, even sunlight. Sometimes I heard him talking to himself, as if he were talking to her. "Why, Emily? I gave you everything. I would have gone to the ends of the earth for you." Other times, just silence. Silence, and the sound of his pen writing in his notebook. The letters began there. Letters that would never be sent. One morning, I found one of those open letters on the table. It read, "You took everything that was alive in me, and yet I forgive you." It was at that moment that I realized he wasn't angry. He was too broken to hate. And that kind of pain is the most dangerous. The pain that is silent, that resigns itself, that accepts the unacceptable. I began investigating on my own. I needed to understand why. I discovered that Victor had left the country on the same flight, with tickets purchased weeks earlier. It was all planned. Her love never existed. It was a sham. They met months before it all began, and the wedding was just a curtain call for the perfect escape. When I told him this, he just laughed. So she used me until the end. I spent that entire night beside his bed. He didn't sleep, just stared at the ceiling. "Mom, you know what's worst?" he asked suddenly. "It's that I still love you, even knowing everything." I choked back tears and held his hand. "True love, my son, sometimes grows in the wrong hearts." He closed his eyes and replied, "Then mine was born in hell." And in that moment, I understood that his suffering wouldn't end there. The discovery didn't bring relief. It brought the beginning of a silent torture. Because the truth, when it arrives too late, doesn't heal. It only opens wounds that never heal. After the news, the house became a mirror of his soul. Dark, cold, and empty. The curtains were drawn, the food sat cold on the table, and silence reigned. My son was no longer the same. He slept all day, woke at night, and spoke little. Sometimes I'd find him sitting on the bed, holding one of the letters he'd written, staring into space. "She must be happy, Mom," he'd say, with a smile that hurt more than any cry. And I, not knowing what to say, just covered him with a blanket, like someone trying to protect what was already crumbling. The doctor said it was reactive depression, but the pretty name didn't lessen the tragedy. It was like watching someone drowning on dry land. He refused medication, therapy, friends. He said he didn't need anyone. "She was the one who cured me," he repeated. The pain consumed him slowly, like a fever that wouldn't go away. I tried forcing smiles, preparing meals, leaving encouraging notes around the house. All in vain. He read them, tore them up, and returned to silence. One night, I woke to a noise in his room. I ran and found him standing in front of the mirror, his eyes sunken, his face pale. "I don't recognize myself anymore, Mother," he murmured. "When she left, she took my soul." I hugged him tightly, but he remained motionless, like a weightless body. In that moment, I realized something in him had broken forever. The man who had once dreamed of the altar now stared into the abyss, and the abyss called his name. Over the next few days, I began to notice little things that terrified me. He stopped shaving, stopped opening the windows, and hid his cell phone like a gun. When I finally managed to get it, I saw that he was checking her social media every day, looking at the photos, the children, the new husband. "They seem happy," he said, his voice cold. "I'm happy for her." But the look was that of someone who had already given up on existence. I tried to seek spiritual help. I took him to church, asked for prayers, lit candles. The priest spoke about forgiveness, about starting over, but he just smiled. "God has abandoned me, Mom," he replied, and left the Mass before it ended. I followed him to the car, and he cried, the dry cry of someone who no longer believes in anything. Not even God understands what she did to me. I wanted to say that God understands everything, but the words died in my throat. Time passed, and the emptiness grew. He could no longer bear listening to music, seeing couples on the street, or watching romantic movies. "Everything reminds me of her," he would say. One afternoon, I found him burning the letters he'd written. The fire illuminated his face, and the smoke rose slowly, as if carrying away the last of his hope. "That's how she left me. In ashes," he murmured. I tried to put it out, but the fire was already inside him. One day, he disappeared for an entire day. I went to the police, desperate. He returned that night, staggering, his eyes lost. "I went to the sea," he said. "I thought about going in and never coming out. But then I remembered you." Those words pierced me like blades. I hugged him and swore I would never leave him alone. But I knew the danger wasn't outside. It was inside him, growing like a silent poison. The following months were a succession of ups and downs. Sometimes he would get better, seeming to be trying to start over. Other times, he would plunge back into darkness. Mother, her love was my life. Now what am I? And I would reply, You're still my son. He would smile slightly, but his eyes betrayed it. He no longer believed in anything. Not me, not himself. One morning, I found the bedroom mirror covered with a sheet. Why did you do that? I asked. He replied, Because I don't want to see who's left anymore. I was exhausted. I spent the day beside him, praying silently. That night before bed, he said, I think I'll rest tomorrow, Mom. I need to rest. I wanted to believe it was just a metaphor, but something inside me knew the worst was yet to come. And it was there, in that moment of apparent calm, that I realized that love, the one that had once brought light, was now the very darkness devouring him. The collapse didn't come suddenly. It came slowly, like a tide rising without fanfare, until it swallowed everything. And I, helpless, could only watch, praying to God not to lose him too, not in body, but in soul. In the days that followed, I lived as if walking on shards of glass. Any wrong step could hurt him even more. I refused to watch him wither away without a fight. I made appointments with psychologists, sought out therapists, priests, pastors, even healers if necessary. Each offered an explanation, a new hope.
He needs time, they said.
But time, instead of healing, seemed to sharpen the pain. He didn't want to talk, eat, or dream. What's there to heal, Mother, if what I was died with her? I insisted on therapy, but he kept coming and staying silent. The psychologist would call me at the end of the sessions and say, He doesn't speak much, but he listens to everything. Stay close. And I stayed. I sat beside him, even when silence was all that remained. Sometimes we would go hours without exchanging a word, just breathing the same air, as if that were enough to keep him alive. It was strange, but that shared silence seemed like the only language he still understood. I tried to take him to the countryside, away from the city. Nature always had a way of embracing what the world rejects. I rented a simple little house, surrounded by greenery. In the first few days, he seemed to calm down. He walked through the woods, looked at the sky, took deep breaths. The air is lighter here, he once said. And I, for the first time in months, felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps there he would rediscover the peace that love had stolen from him. But peace, I realized, doesn't live in places. It lives in the heart. And his was still in ruins. One afternoon, I found him writing again. I thought they were letters to her. But no, they were prayers. Loose, clumsy, but sincere sentences. God, restore the meaning of my life. God, help me not to hate. God, make me forget. I read them secretly, with tears in my eyes. The pain still lingered within him, but now there was something different, an attempt to rebuild himself, even without knowing how. It was the beginning of a silent cry for help. Returning home was difficult. Everything reminded me of Emily. The garden, the sofa, the scent of her perfume that still lingered in the air. I tried moving the furniture, changing the curtains, painting the walls. Nothing worked. Her memory was more persistent than paint, more present than light. He would sometimes stand in front of the mirror, adjusting the tie he never actually wore. I still don't know what to do with that suit, Mom, he would say. I would reply, Keep it. One day it will mean something else. But I didn't believe it myself. I enrolled him in a support group, where people shared losses and new beginnings. At first, he resisted. Then, he began to listen to the stories. He returned home pensive. There are people who suffer more than me, Mom, he confessed. But it hurts just as much. For the first time, I saw empathy in his eyes. a sign that the pain was slowly beginning to transform into understanding. Perhaps this was the seed of healing, understanding that suffering isn't exclusive to anyone. Even so, there were relapses. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find him sitting on the porch, staring into space. "You should sleep, son," I'd say. "Sleep doesn't want anything to do with me, Mom." He spoke with the serenity of someone who's made peace with emptiness. I'd sit beside him, cover his shoulders with a blanket, and pray silently. I wasn't asking him to forget Emily. I was just asking that one day she'd stop hurting. During one of his appointments, the therapist suggested he keep a journal, not about her, but about himself. Write what you feel, without fear.
He tried.
And little by little, he began to rediscover himself. The first pages were sad, full of unanswered questions. But then came good memories, small plans like go back to running or plant something new in the garden. Each sentence was a step, small but firm. The garden, in fact, was the last refuge of his transformation. He had avoided it since his escape. One day, however, I saw him there, his hands covered in dirt. He was replanting the rose bushes. "It's not their fault, Mother," he said, looking at the ground. And in that moment, I understood. Forgiveness began there, not for Emily, but for himself. It was as if, by tending those flowers, he was trying to heal the soil of his own heart. There were many attempts at healing. Some failed. Others opened glimmers of light. But each, in its own way, brought him a little closer to life. There was still pain, of course. But there was also something new, albeit fragile: hope. And when a mother sees hope reborn in her child's eyes, she understands that love, true love, never gives up, even when all seems lost. I found the notebook of letters one cloudy afternoon while tidying his room. It was tucked away in the back of the drawer, yellowed at the edges, as if it had aged along with the pain. The simple cover hid a whole world of feelings that had never left home. I opened it slowly, afraid of desecrating something sacred. And there they were, dozens of letters, written in the shaky handwriting of someone trying to transform suffering into words. Each page was an open wound, and yet there was tenderness. "Why did you leave?" began the first. 3 lines later, he would answer his own question. "Maybe because you were never really here." In another, he wrote, "I still wake up hoping to hear your footsteps in the hallway." And then, "But silence has been more faithful than you." These contradictions hurt. They were the perfect portrait of love that refuses to die, even after being betrayed. I read them one by one, crying softly, because I knew each letter was a piece of what was left of my son. The letters were different. Some filled with anger, others with longing. In one, he wrote, "I hate you for taking the best of me." On the next page, he pleaded, "If you come back, I promise to love you without question." This back and forth of emotions showed how much he struggled with himself, between forgiving and forgetting, between remembering and surviving. And I, as a mother, understood. Because loving too much is a silent way of destroying yourself. One letter in particular struck me. It was short, written in the wee hours of the morning. "Today I dreamed of you smiling. I woke up wanting to die and live at the same time." I closed the notebook with trembling hands. It wasn't just a rant, it was a cry. A cry for help disguised as poetry. I wanted to tear up all the letters, burn them, so he would never have to relive that again. But something stopped me. Perhaps the intuition that, one day, he would need to read them to understand what he had survived. When I confronted him, he wasn't alarmed. "Did you find it?" he asked calmly, as if he'd already expected it. "I found it, son." And I cried with every line. He took a deep breath. "Don't cry, Mom. I wrote to survive, not to suffer." And then he smiled, a sad but sincere smile. As I wrote, I felt I still existed. Each word was a way of saying, "I'm still here." In that moment, I realized the letters weren't about Emily. They were about him trying to find himself again. Over time, the notebook became his inseparable companion. Sometimes he would take it to the garden and write for hours. Other times he would just leaf through it, rereading what he had already said. "You know what's funny, Mom?" he once commented. "The more I write to her, the less I miss her. It's like I'm slowly saying goodbye." That phrase stuck with me. It was proof that, little by little, he was transforming pain into liberation. One day, he handed me a letter separate from the others. "This is for you to read aloud, if I'm ever not here." My heart nearly stopped. "Don't say that, my son." He smiled. "It's just a precaution. Life is uncertain, but your love is what sustains me." I kept that letter as if it were a relic, and never had the courage to open it. To this day, it sleeps at the bottom of a drawer, untouched, like a sealed prayer. The unsent letters became the diary of a soul trying to rebuild itself. He wrote them to her, but deep down, they were addressed to himself. Each word was a brick building the wall between past and future. And though the wall still had cracks, I saw something new there: resilience. He was no longer the broken man he'd started with. He was someone who, even wounded, was beginning to recognize himself in his own scars. One night, I found him rereading one of his early letters. He closed the notebook and said, "You know, Mom, today I realized I don't want her to read it anymore, because what I had to say I've already learned on my own." I hugged him silently. It was the first time since the wedding that I felt my son returning. Not the same, but what was left of him, now stronger, more real. And so, the notebook of unsent letters became a symbol of a discreet new beginning. Because sometimes the love that destroys us is the same love that, when written, teaches us to live again. Time passed without asking permission. Days blended into nights, and the calendar became nothing more than a decoration on the wall. What was once a living pain became a silent presence, like a ghost that no longer frightens, but also won't go away. My son no longer spoke of Emily, not because he'd forgotten her, but because he'd learned to live with the emptiness she left. It was like a scar on his chest. It didn't hurt all the time, but it was always there, a reminder that one day she bled. He stopped writing letters, but the notebook remained on the desk, open to the last page. Sometimes the wind turned the pages, and the light sound of that paper was like a whisper of longing. He had returned to work, slowly, without enthusiasm. His gaze was still distant, as if living in a parallel world. "Time heals everything, Mom," he would say. I smiled, but deep down I knew that time doesn't heal. It only teaches us how to survive with open wounds. Gradually, the visits ceased, his friends drifted away, and solitude became routine. The phone rarely rang. When it did, it was some kind of mistake or advertisement. "It's funny, Mom," he would say. "Before, I feared silence. Now, he's the only one who understands me." And I understood. Silence had become his shelter, and also his prison. It was there, in that space between sound and nothingness, that he hid from the world and, perhaps, from himself. On his birthdays, he never wanted to celebrate. One more year, one less reason. He'd joke, with that bitter humor that only those who've truly suffered understand. I'd make a simple cake, put a candle in it, and he'd blow it out without asking for a wish. "Why wish?" he'd say. "Life doesn't listen to me." And I, with a heavy heart, pretended to laugh. But deep down I begged God to listen to him, even just once. There were attempts at rapprochement. An old friend appeared, bringing back memories of the past, trying to make him smile. They talked a few times, had coffee, until one day he commented, "She's nice, but she doesn't make me feel anything." And that's how I understood that his heart was locked, the key lost among memories. No new love could blossom in a field that still smelled of goodbye. The seasons repeated themselves, but inside the house nothing changed. The garden bloomed and withered, the leaves fell and grew again, and he, motionless, watched it all as a spectator of his own life. "The world goes on, mother," he would say. "I'm the one who stopped." And perhaps he was right. Time didn't move him forward. It just left him standing still while the rest walked. And I, helpless, remained there, believing that one day he would take the first step. One night, while we were having tea, he looked at me and said something I've never forgotten. "You know what's worse than missing someone? It's when it becomes a part of you, and you never want it to go away." I was speechless. He said this without sadness, as if accepting uncomfortable company. And I realized that the suffering no longer crushed him. It simply inhabited him. It was a discreet tenant, not going to leave anytime soon. Even so, there were moments of tenderness. Sometimes he'd laugh at silly things, a cat crossing the yard, a childhood memory, an old song. They were seconds of true life, giving me the strength to carry on. Because even if joy came in crumbs, I gathered them all, with the care of someone saving what's left of a treasure. As the years passed, I began to notice something different. He no longer spoke her name or looked at old photos. One day, he asked if he could donate his wedding suit. "I don't want anything to tie me to what happened anymore." His voice sounded firm, mature. That's when I understood. He hadn't forgotten, but had finally learned to let go. The pain, now, was part of history, not the present. And so it was that the years of silence gradually transformed into years of learning. The love that destroyed him also shaped him. And although the emptiness still lingered, the echo of the pain began to sound different. It was no longer a scream. It was just a distant memory, like the sound of the sea when you close the window. You can still hear it, but it no longer frightens you. It had been almost 5 years without hearing from her. 5 years of silent attempts to move on, to rebuild what was left. Life seemed to have stabilized, calm, predictable, almost peaceful. Until the day the past knocked on the door, disguised as chance. An old friend of mine, passing through town, came over for coffee. We chatted about trivialities until she, unknowingly, dropped the bombshell. "Helena, did you know that Emily lives in Paris now? She married a foreign man and has 2 beautiful children." Time stood still. The spoon fell from my hand, and coffee stained the white tablecloth. My son, who was in the living room, heard the name and froze. He looked at me, then at his friend, and whispered, "Paris?" She nodded, unaware of the consequences of her words. "Yes, she seems to be doing well. She posts pictures, travels a lot." The sentence echoed through the house like thunder. I tried to change the subject, but it was too late. The wound, which had healed on the surface, had just reopened. In the following days, he became strange. He became silent again, withdrawn. The distant look reappeared, as it did on the worst days. I caught him on the computer one night, searching for her name. There it was, a profile full of smiles, travels, children, a garden identical to ours, recreated on the other side of the ocean. "Look, Mom," he said in a low, almost childish voice. She even copied the flowers. It wasn't anger in his gaze. It was something worse, resigned melancholy. The kind of pain that no longer screams, just breathes slowly. I tried to stop him, but he spent hours staring at those photos, like someone visiting the grave of a still-living love. "She looks happy," he said one day. "I'm happy for her." But his eyes betrayed the words. There was a glint of unshed tears, an old weariness. "And you?" I asked. "Are you happy too, son?" He looked at me and replied, "I'm at peace." It's almost the same thing. But I knew peace and giving up are distant cousins. Weeks later, a neighbor mentioned seeing a news report about successful Brazilians in France. There was Emily's face smiling, with Victor by her side. The couple posed in front of a luxurious home surrounded by rose bushes. Fate has a cruel sense of irony, I thought. The same flowers that had witnessed love and betrayal were now blooming in another country, as if mocking the past. I showed the article to my son, thinking he would refuse. But he looked at it calmly and said, "She got what she wanted. I got what was left." For days, he grew more introspective. Sometimes he walked through the garden, other times he just stared at the horizon. Until one morning he called me to the porch. "Mom, you know what I realized? She didn't take everything. She left something here." "What?" I asked, dreading the answer.
He pointed to his chest.
"The scars, but also the lessons." It was the first time I heard something that sounded like liberation, a shred of wisdom born of pain. Even so, that news left its mark. Seeing her again, even from afar, brought back memories, smells, sounds. One night, he said, "Sometimes I think I've lived a whole life inside a dream that wasn't mine."
I didn't know what to say.
I just sat beside him, and, as before, we shared the silence. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't the same silence that separates. It was the silence that encloses. The following Sunday, I went to Mass alone. I lit a candle for her, for him, for myself. Not out of hatred, nor longing, but out of acceptance. When I returned, I found my son watering the plants. "I'm going on a trip, Mom," he said. "I need to see the world through different eyes." I felt a lump in my throat. "Where?" He smiled slightly. "I don't know yet. I just know I don't want to live waiting anymore." And so, ironically, the news from Europe brought the first breath of life in years. The woman who once destroyed him, unknowingly, reawakened him to life. And for the first time, when he walked out the door, I didn't take fear with me. I took hope. Because I understood that even the loves that break us are sometimes the ones that teach us to begin again. For a while, the journey brought lightness. He sent short messages talking about small towns, books he read in cafes, simple people he met along the way. It seemed the weight was finally beginning to dissolve. "I'm learning to walk alone, Mom," he once wrote. And I, on the other side, wept with relief. But like every poorly healed wound, all it took was one wrong touch to bleed again. The relapse came without warning, discreet, almost invisible, until it became an abyss. The first sign was silence. The messages became scarce, then disappeared. When he returned home, I noticed an old, familiar darkness in his eyes. "Is everything okay?" I asked. He replied with a brief smile. "Just tired." But the weariness I saw in his eyes wasn't physical. It was existential. In the following days, he began avoiding the garden, stopped going out, and went back to locking himself in his room. I recognized that pattern, the same one that had preceded the breakdown, the same one that announces pain returning to reclaim what is its own. One night, I heard the sound of the piano he hadn't played in years. The melody was sad, broken, full of pauses. I stood in the doorway, watching him. "Is this song new?" I asked. He replied without looking, "No, it's old. I just changed the ending." There was a tremor in his voice that cut me to the core. When the song ended, he closed the piano and whispered, "I thought I was cured, Mom. But longing doesn't die. It only sleeps." And then, I realized he was still a prisoner of a love that no longer existed, but whose ghost followed him like a shadow. The following weeks were difficult. He started drinking, something he'd never done before. He said it was just a glass to sleep, but the glass became a bottle. The days blurred together. The nights were too long. When I tried to intervene, he'd get irritated. Let me deal with it my way. And I let him, even though my heart was in tatters, because I knew there are pains that only heal when the sufferer decides to stop hurting themselves. But the problem was he no longer wanted to heal, he just wanted to forget. One day, I found a torn envelope on my desk. Inside, a photograph, Emily with her children, walking down a street in Paris. On the back, a handwritten inscription, "For the one who taught me to love." I don't know how that photo got to him, but the message was cruel. I showed him the envelope, and he simply said, She sends her love. After that, he was silent for days. Sometimes I heard him calling her name in his sleep. Other times, he just wept silently. The relapse had taken hold, and this time, it seemed more profound. I tried to seek help again, but he refused. I don't need doctors, Mom. I need meaning. That phrase echoed in my head. What is meaning to someone who lost everything in a single day? I went to sleep with that question and woke up with the answer written in his eyes. The meaning had gone with her. He just wouldn't admit it. One morning, I woke to the sound of breaking glass. I ran and found him on the living room floor, surrounded by bottles. "It's no use, Mom," he murmured. "Everything I try to build, she appears and destroys." I held him, wiping the tears from his face, and said, "She's not here, my son. The only thing left is you." He looked at me, confused, as if seeing his own reflection for the first time in years. What if I don't know who I am without her? I wanted to answer, but I realized that was the question that had been haunting him since the empty altar. In the days that followed, he began writing again, but the letters were different. They were no longer to Emily, but to God. "If there is redemption for those who love wrongly, show me the way." That sentence on one of the pages made me cry, because there, in the midst of his relapse, there was still a spark of faith. Tiny, stubborn, but alive. And it was that spark that kept him going when all seemed lost. Time passed, and the worst began to ease. The drinking lessened, the nights became silent again, and the fever of remembrance began to subside. He was never the same again, but he learned to live with the ghosts. One day, while watering the plants, he said, "You know, Mom, sometimes life doesn't heal. It teaches you how to carry the pain without stumbling." And I, with a heavy heart, replied, "As long as you don't stop walking." The relapse left its mark, but it also brought something new. The certainty that he was still trying. Even hurt, even exhausted, he fought. And that, for me, was already a victory. Because I understood that some new beginnings are born from failure itself. And that was how the love that once destroyed him began to silently shape the man he was becoming. There is no pain comparable to burying someone who still breathes. Seeing my son walk around the house, eat, sleep, and exist, but without Riolito live, it was like living with an absence of flesh and blood. He was there, but the sparkle in his eyes, the one that made him my boy, was gone. Sometimes I'd find him sitting on the sofa, staring into space, as if trying to hear a sound only he could hear. "Is everything okay, son?" I'd ask. He'd smile slightly. "Okay, Mom. Just thinking." But I knew what he called a thought was, in fact, longing disguised as lucidity. As the months passed, he learned to function on autopilot. He worked, ate, slept. He didn't complain, didn't smile, didn't expect anything. He was like a gear spinning purposelessly, just to keep from rusting. I try to strike up a conversation, plan trips, suggest dates. "Shall we visit the sea?" I once proposed. He replied, "The sea is beautiful, but I don't know how to dive anymore." These little phrases hurt more than shouts. It was as if, with each one, he was telling me he was there only out of politeness. The worst part was that, in a way, I had died with him. Mothers are an extension of their children, and when they lose their meaning in life, we lose our footing. I began to live to keep him breathing. Any day he woke without tears was already a victory. I made the coffee stronger, left the bread fresh, opened the windows, all to remind the world that there was still a man inside. But deep down, I knew that wasn't my boy anymore. It was the body of a love that couldn't survive abandonment. Sometimes he'd go for a walk alone. He'd return hours later, his gaze lost. "Where did you go, son?" he'd ask. "I went to visit the past," he'd reply. And I understood. He walked the same streets, looked in the shop windows where he'd strolled with Emily, sat on the same park benches. Those walks were his visits to an invisible tomb. A tomb no one sees, but one that buries dreams, promises, and faith in happiness. There's no cemetery for this kind of grief. It's something he carries in his chest every day. Over time, I realized that hope had turned to resignation. He didn't expect her to return, but he also didn't believe he could love anyone else. He lived in a gray middle ground, between the past that destroyed him and the future that didn't want him. "Mom, I think I was born to miss you," he once said. And I replied, fighting back tears, "No, son. You were born to love. You just loved the wrong person." He just smiled, a tired smile, without strength, without faith. There were times when I thought about giving up. Sometimes I'd look at him and wonder if it made sense to keep trying to bring him back. But every time doubt crept in, I'd remember the boy he'd once been, full of plans, curiosity, life. And then I'd fight again, because a mother doesn't give up, even when everything indicates she's already lost. A mother's love is the last thread holding a soul to earth. And I held that thread with both hands, bleeding if necessary. One morning, while watering the garden, he surprised me. "Mom, do you know what hurts the most?" I looked at him and he added, "It's that I still miss her, but I don't know if I miss the woman she was or the man I was with her." That silenced me, because I understood that he was no longer crying for Emily, but for himself, for the man who believed in happy endings, for the love that believed in destiny. It was mourning for his own innocence. Over the years, I learned to live with this living absence. I learned to talk to him without expecting answers, to love what remained, to accept silence as a form of presence. Sometimes, when I saw him sleeping, I thought, he looks peaceful. And soon after, I corrected myself, or maybe he just looks tired. This doubt stayed with me every night, because the difference between peace and exhaustion is so small when the heart is wounded. Today, when I look at him, I still see the same face, the same body, but a different soul. A soul that survived, but has lost the glow of faith. He lives, yes, but as if he walks between two worlds, that of the living and that of those who have given up. And I, from my corner, continue praying that one day he will return from where he never left, from within his own emptiness. Because there is no greater pain than this, having a child alive and yet feeling every day that he is gone. The years followed their own rhythm, indifferent to the pain. The world changed, the seasons passed, and my son grew older. His once young face bore the marks of an ancient suffering that time could not erase. But what hurt me most was seeing that, even after everything, he still expected something, not from her, but from life itself. He expected, perhaps, an explanation.
A sign.
A plea for forgiveness that never came. And the longer the silence persisted, the more his heart closed, like a flower weary of the sun. One night, I found him sitting in the garden, under the moon. "Mom, do you believe she thinks of me sometimes?" he asked, without looking at me. I took a deep breath. "I don't think anyone forgets someone they've hurt deeply, son." He smiled sadly. "Then maybe she remembers me every time she sees a man giving too much of himself." That sentence chilled me to the core. It was the exact portrait of what he had become, a man who loved so much that he forgot to protect himself. "Love is not a mistake, my son," I replied. "But sometimes the mistake is loving someone who doesn't know what to do with so much love." He sighed and said, "I just wish she'd said she was sorry, that she'd acknowledged what she did." I was speechless, because I knew deep down that forgiveness would never come. Emily had moved on, and perhaps no longer remembered the destruction she'd left behind. "What if the forgiveness you hope for never comes?" I asked. He was silent for a moment and replied, "Then I'll learn to live without it." But his eyes betrayed it. He still didn't know how. The days returned to their routine, work, simple dinners, short conversations. His pain no longer screamed, but it also didn't heal. It was like a low-grade fever that never goes away, constant, discreet, stubborn. Sometimes I'd see him leafing through his old notebook, the one with the letters he'd never sent. Do you still read it? I asked once. He shook his head.
No.
I just like to remember that I managed to get it all out. This brought me some relief, because, even without forgiveness, he had found a way to empty his soul. But there were days when the past came rushing back. All it took was a song, a scent, a vague memory. She should have apologized, Mom. That was all. One word, and everything would be easier. I wanted to believe it was true, but I knew it wouldn't be. Her forgiveness, even if it came, wouldn't restore what he'd lost: the faith in love, the trust in others, the sparkle in her eyes. Some wounds can't be healed with apologies. They need something greater: acceptance. One Sunday afternoon, while we were sorting through family photos, he found an old picture of the two of them, taken in the garden. Look, those were different times, weren't they? He said with a half smile. I looked at him and asked, Do you still hate her? He thought for a moment, then replied, No, but I haven't forgiven her either. I think the opposite of hate isn't forgiveness, Mom. It's indifference. And I'm not there yet. The sincerity of his answer cut me to the quick, but it also gave me hope. Because those who acknowledge their own wounds have already begun to heal them. Over time, I realized that forgiveness wasn't something he owed her. It was something he owed himself.
But he didn't see it that way.
If I forgive you, it'll feel like everything was in vain, he'd say. And I tried to explain. Forgiving isn't forgetting. It's freeing yourself. He listened, but remained a prisoner of the past. Perhaps he expected the apology to come like a magic key. But what he didn't see is that the key had always been in his hands. Years later, when I fell ill, he began caring for me. The cold nights were quieter, and our conversations became confessions. Mom, if I could go back in time, would I have loved less? He asked one night. I looked at him and said, No, my son. Having loved so much is what makes you human. What destroyed you was expecting someone else to feel the same way. He nodded, his eyes welling. Maybe the forgiveness I needed was never hers, but mine. Today, when I reflect on everything, I realize that forgiveness never came because perhaps it was never necessary. What my son needed was to understand that not all pain can be explained, nor can every absence be filled. Some only teach. And that's how I learned, along with him, that love, no matter how cruel, always leaves a seed. Sometimes it blossoms into forgiveness. Other times, only into silence. But in both cases, it teaches the soul to begin anew. And the forgiveness that never came, perhaps it came in another way, the moment he decided to keep living, even without answers. Because carrying on, even in ruins, is, in itself, the most beautiful forgiveness of all. They say time heals everything, but it's not true. Time only teaches us to live with what is no cure. My son learned this the cruelest way. By loving someone who ran away without looking back. She never asked for forgiveness, and maybe never asked, but he survived. And in his survival, he found something greater than forgiveness: strength itself. Today, when I look at him walking through the garden, I see that there is still pain, yes, but there is also dignity, because moving forward, even when wounded, is the quietest and noblest act of courage. Life did not give him back his lost love, but it gave him back himself. And maybe that's what fate does when it takes everything away from us. It forces us to find ourselves again. Have you ever loved someone who left without explanation? Have you ever waited for forgiveness that never came? Tell us in the comments. Sometimes sharing your pain is the first step to healing. And if this story touched you, like it, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. There's still a lot to tell, and who knows, in the next video, you might discover that you weren't the only one who loved too much.